Welcome to the Worth It Practice podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Leah Kliansky, and today I'm going to be talking about why the Worth It Practice podcast is actually a little bit taboo, why it's radical for me to start a podcast like this as a psychologist entrepreneur and as a female entrepreneur. I'm also going to tell you why I did it anyway, and I'm going to continue to have this podcast. If you know much about me, or really anything about me and the kinds of content that I'm putting out there in the world, you will know that this is not my first podcast and it is not my only podcast. So in addition to being the host of the Worth It Practice podcast, I am also the host of the Educated Parent podcast. The Educated Parent podcast is about 6 months old at the time of this recording. I started it in April of 2025. And the Educated Parent podcast is very different. So the goal of the Educated Parent podcast is for me to have my clinical psychologist hat very much on, and I am providing expert advice to help parents solve everyday parenting problems. So in one episode, I'm giving advice about what to do if your child hits you. That's a topic. Or how to help your child if they are anxious after a nightmare. For that one, I had a guest come in. So it is me very much drawing from my clinical knowledge, very much drawing from the skills gained in my training, in my PhD, in my 15 years of clinical experience, and the clinical experience of other psychologists and other therapists that I bring on to be guests on my podcast. I really love doing the Educated Parent podcast. It is really fun for me to talk about my clinical work and to integrate that into my experience as a parent who's also in the trenches with other parents. That podcast is fun. That podcast is not taboo or very controversial. Educated Parent, I'm doing what people would expect of me. And that doesn't make it wrong. I still really love it. I'm being a quote unquote good psychologist. For this episode, if you are listening to it as a podcast instead of watching it on YouTube, every time I say good psychologist, know that I'm putting air quotes around good. Okay, so you imagine me doing air quotes. So when I am doing the Educated Parent podcast, I am being a good psychologist. I am talking from my clinical expertise. That's socially acceptable. I'm talking about children and families, which as a woman kind of makes me a good woman. The topics I talk about might be controversial to some people if you don't like science and evidence-based treatment. But in general, this is content that everyone is very comfortable with me putting out there. The Worth It Practice podcast is not that way because I am violating social norms. The Worth It Practice podcast, I am violating the norms of psychologists, what we are supposed to do, therapists, and also just being a female business owner. Let's talk about that. In what ways am I violating these norms? Before I tell you how, I'm going to tell you what is expected of a good psychologist. And if you are not a psychologist, and especially if you haven't gone to like a very strict, rigorous academic PhD program, you might not know what the rules are. But let me tell you, there are rules. And by the way, these aren't rules that like regular everyday people have about us. These are rules that the psychologist community has about us. So my dream, my entire life, starting in early childhood, was to become a child psychologist and open a group private practice. And if you listen to one of my early episodes, you'll hear me talk about this in a lot of detail. But essentially, my parents are psychologist entrepreneurs. They had a business that they loved their entire lives, and I wanted to do the same thing just in my own way. But I wanted to do it like them as a psychologist with a PhD. And so all of my life was me doing the things in order to get myself into that PhD program. When I was applying to PhD programs, if I had told them what I wanted to do with my PhD, that my goal was to graduate and then open a group private practice, I would not have gotten into any programs because wanting to go into business is not socially acceptable as a psychologist thing to do. So there are some very narrow options, or at least there were when I graduated in 2012. So here are the things that you are allowed to do as a psychologist. You're allowed to go into research. That's what my mentor wanted me to do. By the way, I love research. I think doing psychological research is an excellent foundation for clinical practice. Learned so much. Don't regret all of the research experience that I got. I've never wanted to be a researcher, but going into research and getting grants and training research assistants and other graduate students and publishing, this is like definitely an acceptable, esteemable path for a psychologist, for a clinical psychologist. Another acceptable path is being in an academic setting, especially in an academic setting that is associated with a hospital. If you are an assistant professor, you can be doing clinical work, you can be running programs, you can be supervising trainees like interns and postdocs. That is all very acceptable as a psychologist. You can also work in a hospital. You can be providing counsel and liaison services, especially if you have this dual role where you're also like supervising students who are in training, educating. Maybe you're going to take the data there and publish it even though you're not primarily a researcher, right? All of these like institutional roles are what good psychologists are ideally supposed to do. Any of those answers would have been acceptable when I was applying to my PhD program. Now, good psychologists are allowed to do a little bit of business. You know, one thing you can do that no one will be too shocked if you do is open a solo private practice, especially if it is on the side of your other major hospital work. That is okay, by psychologists. So if you have a solo practice and you're also in the hospital and you're seeing, a small caseload a week, totally fine. You can go out into completely solo private practice. Again, that's not what my mentor would have wanted me to do. That is also acceptable at a certain point, especially if you've already done the institutional academic or hospital or researchy stuff, and then you decide you leave for solo private practice. That can be acceptable. So those are some different acceptable options. But wanting to really dive into business, really being fascinated by that, wanting for it to take off, viewing yourself as an entrepreneur, as a primary identity, trying to build something bigger, full of imagination and creativity, caring about profit at all, caring about being able to provide for your team, for your staff, for yourself so that you are thriving. Those things are not what a good psychologist does. Those are not the tracks you're set up for when you decide to get your PhD. And if you do it, and if you talk about it, well, aren't you opening yourself up for some judgment? And the way that judgment can come in is that you're only supposed to do things that you have a degree in. And this is something that psychologists deeply internalize. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to where they're like, I'll never figure this marketing stuff out. I don't have a degree in marketing. How will I figure this business stuff out? I don't have an MBA. We are so trained to be so focused on the things that our degree is for that we're afraid to do things outside of it. And I'm guilty of that too. Right? So people will say, I don't know if it's within your scope to do this thing, to open this business, to do this practice. So it is very taboo for me to move into this and then to work on seeing myself as a psychologist entrepreneur, growing it and talking about it. You're not supposed to talk about it. You're absolutely not supposed to say things like, I have a 7-figure group private practice. And then when we get into charging outside of insurance, especially premium fees, that's also something you're not supposed to do or talk about if you're a good psychologist. And this gets into whether or not you're a good therapist as well. There is a really wonderful podcast called the Bad Therapist podcast that I really enjoy. And it talks a lot about that social conditioning that therapists get. But I think psychologists get even more social conditioning around what is acceptable for us. So by doing this and talking about my practice, I am not being a good psychologist. The other thing that I'm doing on this podcast that is really controversial, both by psychologists and by standards for women, is that I'm telling you that I am good at business. I'm good at being a business owner. I'm not supposed to tell anyone that I'm good at this, right? We're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to take credit. It's braggy, potentially, to take ownership of being good at something. It has taken me years to be able to even tell myself that I am good at business, like truly years. And that is because the conditioning to be humble and to not acknowledge the things that you are actually good at, like that conditioning has been so incredibly strong. I think probably only within the past 6 months have I felt like I could say that out loud, let alone tell you that on a podcast, let alone tell you that I am good enough at business that if you want to have what I have, you should hire me as a consultant. And by the way, you should be willing to pay for my level of expertise, experience, and the results you will get. None of that is a socially acceptable thing for a psychologist to do, for a therapist to do, or for a woman to do. So that's why having this podcast is a little bit terrifying sometimes, because I am just breaking the rules. So why am I doing it? Number one, because I want to. I'm doing this because it brings me joy and pleasure to talk about business. I am fascinated by business. I love running these experiments in my practice and seeing what happens. And I love sharing the things that I learn. I realize this is actually the similarity between the Educated Parent podcast and the Worth It Practice podcast. I love learning things, being really good at them, and sharing my expertise with other people. It fills me with joy, especially when I get to share it with people who are actually interested. If I'm not sharing it with you, I have to share it with my husband, who is an engineer and such a kind person and is so uninterested in hearing me go on and on about business for psychologists. Not interesting to him. Hopefully you're interested in it. But I'm doing this because I just want to. It just feels good. I enjoy sharing these thoughts on a podcast. The second reason is that I need you to see me do it. So remember all of those other things that I said a quote unquote good psychologist can do? I want to make a clear point that all of those things are wonderful. Like, there are many people who deeply enjoy being researchers and academics and in hospital settings and doing trainings and having a very small private practice or having a full solo practice. Like, all of those things are wonderful. I think people should do exactly what they want. But if deep down you are wondering if you could be good at business, if you feel the feeling that I feel, if you are a real entrepreneur and you're like, I want to be big, I want to do things, and I don't know if it's possible for me as a psychologist, I want to tell you that it's completely possible and you can watch me do it. And watching other people do things gives us so much more faith in ourselves. And I am constantly, personally being inspired by other female entrepreneurs, both within and without the therapist space. Like, representation does matter. Watching other people do the scary things absolutely makes a difference. Whenever I am questioning myself in business, as I've been on this journey, listening to, for example, Danielle Swim talk about her mindset, suddenly I think about my own mindset. When I listen to other business podcasts, I start realizing that the skills they're using are not so different than the skills I'm using. For me, one thing that was really radical was hearing Nicole McCants, who has the Business Savvy Therapist and is also a psychologist, talk about the fact that she used to have a group practice with 55 clinicians in it, and that she was able to sell it, and that she actually made a lot of money doing both parts of those things. It did not occur to me that I could have a large practice until I heard Danielle talk about it. Like, you just don't even know the rules you've made for yourself sometimes until you watch someone else break the rules. And then you realize you can break those rules too. Being able to live out your dream is worth it. Having confidence in yourself is worth it. Trusting yourself and making the decisions that are right for you is absolutely worth it. And what we know about ourselves, what I know about myself, is I can learn anything. And I know that you can learn anything too. And so if you are realizing inside that you wanted to have something like I have, you really want to explore business as a psychologist, I would love to help if you feel like what I'm talking about is resonating with you. So if you're like, you know what, I want a mentor who is doing the kinds of things that I want to do, especially right now in this economy, definitely fill out an application. We can book a call and see if we're a good fit to work together. You can also just watch for free how I implement different strategies into my own practice. You can join the Worth It Practice newsletter. You'll hear the results of me listening to 15 hours of podcasts a week and then telling you which of these podcasts I think are the best and how I'm using them in my own business when applicable. And all you do is sign up through the link below. So I am so excited. I am going to continue sharing and being taboo and being a little bit bad because it's kind of fun to be a rebel to the extent that a very type A rule follower can be a rebel. All right, take great care of yourselves. I will see you next Tuesday.